Last video, I showed you a few settings inside of brushes, but I didn't explain how they work, what's going on, what the jitter was, why it needed to be at 0% or any of that. I need to cover that, but before I do, we need to talk about how navigating the brush settings works. And that means doing a little bit of setup first. We have the Cute Snail brush, which is just a brush that is essentially a stamp of a captured snail. And I'll just delete that for now. I have the whole thing selected with a Control A. That's the same thing as Edit Select All. And that allows me to just press Delete to clear this out without having to do anything else, anything fancy. I need another window so that I can demonstrate the controls that happen with the stylus. In this case, I have a Cintiq. So I'm going to go to Window, Arrange, New Window, which will pop up in another tab of the same name of the previous one. Notice size, jitter, pen pressure, you're on layer 2, size, jitter, pen pressure, .psd, layer 2, break that off. And if I click, the same thing will happen on either window, regardless of which one I click in, because it's the same file, it's just different views. The reason I did that is I could drag this all the way down to where my Cintiq is so that I can work on everything. I need to zoom, so I can press Z on the keyboard, hold down Alt, click a couple of times. You can't see anything, but I've just zoomed out. Remember, while I have the zoom tool, all of the brush settings are not available to me. I need to have a brush or a pencil or a dodge tool or something along those lines to get going. We're just going to stick with the standard brush for now while we go through it. I'm going to, with this cute snail, I'm going to shrink it down with the left bracket key. I could also click up here and I could just reduce it. Notice I don't have a hardness control. The hardness control only works with the standard rounds or square brushes. And essentially it's the anti-aliasing, but I always think of it more of a feathering. I can control the hardness, and that's basically just the anti-alias, or so Photoshop's manual claims. This fuzziness is really closer to a feather because it spreads beyond where it is. Keep in mind that if you're using a brush, a hardness of 0, or a hardness of 100, which is what I meant to do, will still have anti-aliasing on it. Notice that if we zoom in a whole lot, we have 100% of the color selected, just this nice little blue. But as we get out, it becomes progressively more transparent. If I put a blue behind it, you'd see that it's becoming, well, it might be a little hard. I'll go ahead and click with this pink color instead. Boop. See how it's just becoming transparent, so it's mixing with whichever color is below it. And that's great for soft edges. Sometimes you do not want any soft edges. Now you're never going to get away from that with the brush tool, but you will get away with having hard edges with the pencil tool. So now I have a standard round brush. I click, and I keep hitting the wrong key. And I zoom in, and you can see that it is in fact a jagged piece. Now, the reason that I bring this up, I believe I've covered that already, is with the snail brush, the Cute Snail. Notice with the pencil, it has no anti-aliasing, which means there's not really any grays. It's just the same effect that you'd have if you had a dissolve mode. We'll talk about that in a few classes' time. It's a way of creating this transparency, but it's either on or it's off. There's no anti-aliasing whatsoever. If we switch back from pencil to brush, and again to the snail, we click, we get all those gray anti-alias lines. But what's interesting is we do not have a hardness. So hardness is reserved for essentially round or square brushes that come default with Photoshop. So heads up on that. And there's a reason I said all that now. Let's take a look at how to navigate the brush settings. Under the brush settings tab, you'll see that there's a button that says brushes. If I click this, it will simply open up our stored brushes palette. And if this were closed entirely, it would open it up. So that's a useful little gadget. Notice I don't have the brushes selected. I used the zoom tool, press B on the keyboard for brush. Now I've unlocked all these things. This over here is the brush tip shape menu that gives us the brush tips. Depending on the version of Photoshop, it will arrange this differently. On a scant few versions of Photoshop, it will add them in logically at the end. In many versions of Photoshop, it will kind of stuff it in the middle between the current brushes and the legacy ones, is usually how it goes. So somewhere in here we have our snail tip, and we can hunt around for it. I like to try to keep track of these. I think I saw it. I like to try to keep track of these, especially in the event that I'm using a dual brush, which we'll talk about later in this class, this very series of videos. I'll leave it for now, though. Somewhere hidden is our snail. Somewhere. We'll get back to him because we know that he's selected. We have all of these great tool settings: shape dynamics, scattering, texture, dual brush, color dynamics, transfer, and brush pose. If we were to click on one of those, it would automatically check the box, meaning it's active, and it would go to this menu, which gives us all these controls, which we'll cover soon. But first, heads up, if we set a control, for example, the angle jitter to direction, which we covered last video, I'm going to shrink this down. If it will let me shrink this down, boom. A little too small. There we go. So now we'll flip and kind of follow the angle that my mouse is moving. If I were to choose the horrifying snail tube, flip the color here, it did not store that. And if I switch back to the snail now, it's lost that setting as well. So if I wanted to play around with some settings and then see how that would look on a different capture brush, I can actually do that. In fact, a different brush altogether. If I go to brush settings and now check shape dynamics to activate it and give it the rotation jitter, I can do this. Now you can of course save your settings by clicking the flyout menu and choosing new brush preset. And we would call this snail with angle jitter. And I do not like to capture the size in the preset or the tool settings, so we'll just leave it as is. Now we've got it with the angle jitter. Oops, did I remember to turn it on? No, I did not. So I need to go in and actually turn on angle jitter. It looks like I hit the wrong thing altogether. Angle jitter, and set that to direction. Now we'd save it. This little snafu is actually useful. That means I can come over here and we have the snail with angle jitter and we have angle jitter snail. I'm just going to get rid of this, the wrong one, by dragging it to the little trash can. Boom. And so now it's gone. So that's actually useful. So if we wanted to check and see how this would look on, say, our snail tube, we'd need to copy that parameter over somehow. Now I'm going to press delete here. Now the way to do that is to use this lock. It does not do what you'd expect. Everything else in Photoshop would use this lock to simply lock the tip shape variation on this stored brush. So in other words, you wouldn't be able to come in and change something by accident, but you can see I can still select everything. What it's doing is locking it in so that if I go to another brush, like the horrifying snail tube, let me switch the color. Now it's hard to tell. The horrifying snail tube has maintained that angle jitter. And if we come over here, we'll see that the angle jitter is still set to direction. So you can store settings that you're testing by clicking this lock, and then you can go through other brushes and see how it would affect those brushes, which is pretty neat. Terribly labeled. Now another way to test things is to click the checkbox next to them, and that will let us see what it would look like without it altogether. In the case of the horrifying snail tube, a little bit of a difference you can see between the two, but not a big difference. Flip the color red again. With it, without it. Slight difference. We can zoom in to see it better. You can see that the little antenna we're flipping around or not flipping around, depending on if we had the angle jitter. All right, let me get the brush. You know what? I'm going to zoom in again first. There we go. All right, let me get the brush. So that's what the checkbox does, whether or not things are actually active. The lock simply determines if things will bounce over. Now, if you did some changes, like let's say we had the horrifying snail tube selected, and we went in and unlocked the shape dynamics. And I'm just going to very quickly do something called color dynamics. I'm going to explain this later. But for now, you can see how it's changing colors between the two. We'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to lock it, and I'm going to come over to the flyout menu and make another preset and call it, you know what, before I do that, shape dynamic, set this off. I'm going to lock that. I'm going to call this colorful snail tube. And now we're going to pop back over to our angle jitter snail. And notice that because it was locked, the angle jitter snail has the color jitter as well, the color dynamic as well. So what if I wanted to get rid of that? I could go to the flyout menu and I could reset all locked settings. Boop. Now, one would think that that would simply reset the locked settings that came over, but that's not the case. And I'm not entirely clear if they did this on purpose or not, but it will not only reset the locked settings, it will reset all of the settings. Remember, we have the angle jitter snail selected, which means that we should have shape dynamics on with the angle jitter control set to direction, but it's gone. Now, if we click on angle jitter snail again, it will reload it with direction control locked in, but it will not load in the color dynamic. So if we were to switch over to this color, you can see that it is back to normal. So it's a way to get rid of the locks, but it will clear all of your settings. So you need to clear it by going to reset all lock settings. And then you need to go over and select a different brush or reselect the initial one to get your settings back. So honestly, that tool doesn't work particularly well. It should just reset it by loading this in without your lock settings. But hey, that's life. Notice if we come back over to our stored colorful snail tube, it is also unlocked and it has reloaded the settings. If we were to go in and to the flyout menu and tell it clear brush controls, we still have our colorful snail tube shape, but as soon as we reset it, or clear the brush control, sorry, it will get rid of all of the settings except for smoothing. We'll talk about that one in a minute. And then we're back to essentially a default brush, the same thing as our horrifying snail tube in general, which did not have any additional settings on it. That means that you can toggle around in between. I don't find it particularly useful unless you've imported other people's brush libraries or you're trying to help them troubleshoot a brush, at which point clearing things out can be useful. If you're trying to figure things out, it's usually better just to go through these one at a time. Now, keep in mind, if you just go to look at something, it will automatically turn it on. So if you had, for example, let's go back to our jitter snail, or angle jitter snail. If we were to uncheck shape dynamics because we wanted to test some other things without shape dynamics on, we're playing around with color dynamics or something. If we wanted to look one more time at what we had for shape dynamics, it would reactivate everything by default. So watch out for that one too. It's a little navigational issue. Under the brush pose, we stop getting these little lines, which is interesting. And that means that all of these tools here, noise, wet edges, build up smoothing, and protect texture, behave differently than the rest of these. It actually means that they don't have a menu that you can view. So it's an on-off proposition for the most part. You do have smoothing options that you can control, but it's not in the brush settings. It's actually over in your options bar here under smoothing. And so that gets a little strange and a little complicated. And yeah, basically any of these guys, you're not going to edit them inside of brush settings. Heads up on that. In fact, most of them have to do with just your options here. So for example, we put wet edges, and if we did have a wet edge control, which I don't believe they have anymore, in earlier versions of Photoshop they would, that button would check, but that's not in there. Smoothing corresponds directly as to whether or not you have any smoothing, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The last piece of navigation here is to remember that the brush tip shape is a menu, and it just doesn't have an activation, deactivation. It's always true. Now, heads up on that. Normally you have a little preview of your brush tip. For example, if we were to select this brush tip, this shape, whatever it is kind of a teeny weeny little preview right here. It's just the same thing. With a few exceptions, you have little pictographs instead. All of these guys are bristle brushes. We'll talk about what those are later. You have erotables, the little pencil, talk about that later, and you have airbrushes, and we'll talk about that later. Sufficient to say if you click on one, it will change the way that the brush tip shape menu works. This is a reference to the type of brush that you have. We'll delve into those once we finish covering everything in the standard capture brush. Before we can get into everything in the capture brush, though, it's important that we talk about what these little oddballs are and how they work. So we'll cover those in the next video. See you in a minute.